Hey man, this is one of those truths that hits harder the more you've lived. A woman doesn't pull away from you because you're weak when you refuse disrespect. She pulls away because you removed a role she wanted you to play. And that role was never the strong, grounded man she claimed to want. It was the man who absorbs emotional chaos, swallows subtle insults, and stays available no matter how poorly he's treated. The moment you don't tolerate that anymore, something inside her short circuits. Because disrespect isn't always about dominance, it's about testing boundaries. When she interrupts you, dismisses your concerns, speaks sideways to you, or subtly undermines your position, she isn't always trying to hurt you. She's trying to see how much of herself she can unload onto you without consequence. And the man who accepts it, who explains, apologizes, softens, or stays quiet, signals something very specific. You can do more. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most men don't want to hear. When you calmly stop tolerating disrespect, you don't become more attractive to her, you become less useful. Because usefulness, in her emotional world, often means regulation. She wants someone who can carry her instability without forcing her to confront it. The beta isn't desired because he's weak, he's desired because he absorbs. This is why women will say they want confidence, strength, and self-respect, yet emotionally gravitate toward men who tolerate behavior they themselves would never accept. Not because they admire weakness, but because boundaries feel like resistance, and resistance threatens the emotional control they unconsciously rely on to feel safe. A man who doesn't tolerate disrespect forces her to regulate herself, and that feels uncomfortable. When you calmly call something out, when you withdraw attention instead of arguing, when you don't chase after emotional whiplash, she doesn't interpret that as maturity. She interprets it as loss of influence, and in her internal world, loss of influence feels like rejection. So rather than adapt, she disengages, not because you are wrong, but because you didn't bend. The beta stays because he's afraid of losing her. The grounded man leaves because he's unwilling to lose himself. And that distinction matters more than attraction ever will. Women ignore men who don't tolerate disrespect because those men don't offer the emotional leverage required to keep the fantasy alive. You can't manipulate someone who isn't invested in proving his worth. This is why the moment you stop explaining yourself, stop justifying your reactions, and stop negotiating basic respect, things go quiet. She pulls back, she becomes distant. She labels you cold, changed, or emotionally unavailable. Not because you became worse, but because you stopped participating in a dynamic where she had the upper hand. A woman who wants a beta doesn't want him because she respects him. She wants him because he's predictable. She knows how far she can push. She knows he'll stay. She knows that even if she crosses a line, he'll rationalize it, forgive it, or blame himself for it. That's comfort. That's control. And control feels safer than equality to someone who lives emotionally. The man who doesn't tolerate disrespect introduces uncertainty, not about his value, but about her power. And uncertainty is destabilizing. It forces reflection. It forces accountability. It forces her to ask questions she'd rather avoid. So instead of leaning in, she disconnects. She seeks a dynamic where the rules are looser and the consequences are softer. So if you've noticed women going quiet, pulling away, or losing interest the moment you enforce boundaries, don't misread that as failure. That's not rejection. That's incompatibility revealing itself. You didn't lose her attention. You removed yourself from a role that required self-abandonment. And the women who only thrive when you tolerate disrespect, they were never aligned with your future anyway. What most men don't realize is that disrespect is rarely loud at first. It starts quietly, almost invisibly. A sarcastic tone, a dismissive glance, a joke that lands just a little too sharp. These aren't accidents. They're probes, and every time you let one pass without consequence, you teach her something about your limits, or more accurately, about the lack of them. When you finally decide to stop tolerating it, she doesn't experience that as strength. She experiences it as betrayal of the script. In her mind, the relationship had an unspoken agreement. She expresses freely. You adapt silently. The moment you disrupt that arrangement, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability, to an emotionally driven person, feels unsafe, even when it's healthy. This is why enforcing boundaries doesn't spark conversations, it sparks distance. She doesn't ask what changed. She doesn't reflect on her behavior. She simply disengages, because engaging would require acknowledging that her behavior had consequences, and consequences threaten the emotional comfort she built around the beta dynamic. A beta is valuable, not because he's loved, but because he's available. He's always reachable, always willing to explain, always open to repair, even when nothing was broken on his end. That availability becomes emotional infrastructure. Take it away, and the entire dynamic collapses, not slowly, instantly. The grounded man, on the other hand, doesn't debate respect. He doesn't bargain for decency. He doesn't escalate or plead. He simply removes access, and that silence is far more disruptive than anger ever could be, because anger can be negotiated. Silence means the game has ended. This is where many men make the mistake of chasing clarity. They want closure. They want understanding. They want her to see why what she did wasn't acceptable. But she isn't confused. She understands perfectly. What she doesn't accept is the loss of control, and no amount of explanation will restore that. So she reframes the story. She calls you rigid. She calls you sensitive. She says you overreacted. Not to hurt you, but to preserve her self-image. Because in her emotional world, being wrong feels like being unsafe. And safety always comes before truth. This is why the men who tolerate disrespect often stay longer, but never win. They're kept close, not cherished. They're relied on, not respected. They become emotional furniture, useful, familiar, and replaceable. And deep down, they feel it. That slow erosion of dignity isn't accidental. It's the cost of staying where you don't belong. When a woman ignores a man who won't tolerate disrespect, she isn't choosing strength elsewhere. She's choosing comfort. She's seeking a dynamic that allows her to remain emotionally unchallenged. One where she can express without restraint and never be required to self-correct. And if you're the man who refuses to play that role, you'll often be painted as the problem. But understand this clearly. The distance wasn't caused by your boundaries. It was caused by the collapse of a dynamic that depended on your silence. And once that collapses, there is no middle ground, only separation. A woman doesn't consciously say to herself, "I want a man who tolerates disrespect." What she feels instead is something far more subtle and far more dangerous: relief. Relief that she doesn't have to regulate herself. Relief that her emotions can spill without consequence. Relief that she can speak carelessly, act impulsively, and still be met with presence instead of boundaries. And that relief becomes addictive. The man who removes it by standing firm doesn't feel strong to her, he feels disruptive. Not because he did anything wrong, but because he interrupted a dynamic that allowed her to avoid self-awareness. This is why men who hold their ground are often met with confusion rather than conversation. She doesn't come forward asking what went wrong, because from her internal perspective, nothing she did feels wrong. The emotional system she's operating in doesn't flag disrespect as a violation, it flags resistance as danger. So when you don't tolerate the behavior, you aren't seen as self-respecting. You're seen as withdrawing emotional permission, and permission to someone used to unchecked expression feels like power. The beta stays because he mistakes endurance for loyalty. He believes that if he just remains calm enough, patient enough, understanding enough, the chaos will eventually settle. But chaos doesn't settle when it's rewarded. It expands. Every ignored boundary teaches her that emotional overflow is acceptable. Every forgiven insult teaches her that respect is optional. And over time, she doesn't even notice herself crossing lines because the environment has trained her that lines don't exist. When a man finally stops tolerating that environment, he's not making a dramatic exit. He's simply refusing to participate in a system that drains him. But to her, it feels abrupt. It feels cold. It feels unfair. Because she had grown accustomed to a version of him that absorbed pressure without pushing back. The shift isn't jarring because he became harsh. It's jarring because he became immovable. This is why women often ignore men who enforce boundaries instead of fighting them. Fighting would require engagement. Engagement would require examination. And examination would require acknowledging that her behavior played a role in the rupture. Silence is easier. Distance preserves the emotional narrative. She can tell herself you changed, you became difficult, you weren't the same anymore, without ever confronting why that change occurred. A man who doesn't tolerate disrespect forces a choice she doesn't want to make: grow or leave. And growth is uncomfortable. Growth requires accountability. Growth means learning how to pause before reacting, how to communicate without dominance, how to respect limits that aren't emotionally convenient. Many women would rather disengage than confront that mirror. Not because they're incapable, but because they've never been required to. The beta offers an easier path. He softens the mirror. He reframes her behavior so she doesn't have to. He turns disrespect into misunderstanding. He turns accountability into conflict avoidance. And in doing so, he becomes less of a man and more of an emotional buffer. He's not chosen for desire. He's chosen for stability, without authority. The grounded man, by contrast, doesn't argue about respect. He doesn't demand it. He simply structures his life in a way where disrespect loses access. And that structure is terrifying to someone who relies on emotional flexibility to feel in control. Because once access is conditional, behavior matters. And once behavior matters, fantasy starts collapsing. This is why enforcing boundaries doesn't usually lead to reconciliation. It leads to exposure. It exposes whether she's capable of self-regulation or dependent on emotional dominance. It exposes whether she values partnership or leverage. And once that truth surfaces, attraction either transforms or disappears. There is no in-between. So if you've noticed women growing distant, colder, or indifferent, the moment you stop tolerating subtle disrespect, understand what's actually happening. You didn't lose value. You revealed incompatibility. You didn't become less attractive. You became less controllable. And for women who want the beta, not the equal, that distinction is everything. One of the most misunderstood moments in modern dating is when a man finally chooses himself and the woman responds by disappearing. To the man, it feels backward. He didn't insult her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten or manipulate. He simply stopped allowing behavior that chipped away at his self-respect. And yet the result is silence, distance, emotional withdrawal. But that reaction isn't punishment, it's exposure. Because what she was attached to wasn't you. It was the version of you that tolerated imbalance. In her emotional framework, tolerance often gets mistaken for love. Not because love requires suffering, but because suffering without consequence creates familiarity. She gets used to pushing, testing, destabilizing, and seeing you remain. That consistency feels like security, but it's false security. It's built on your self-denial. The moment you remove that, the illusion collapses, and she no longer knows where she stands. This is why women who want the beta don't chase men with firm boundaries. They circle men with soft edges, men who can be shaped, guilted, redirected, and emotionally steered. A man who doesn't tolerate disrespect is difficult to steer because he doesn't need emotional approval to stay centered. His stability comes from alignment with himself, not validation from her reactions. When you calmly disengage instead of arguing, when you step back instead of pleading, something unsettling happens inside her. The emotional leverage disappears. She can't provoke reassurance. She can't trigger a chase. She can't pull you into repair mode. And without that push-pull, the dynamic feels empty, not peaceful, empty, because chaos was the glue holding it together. That's why she may accuse you of being distant, cold, or uncaring. Not because you are, but because you no longer react in ways that affirm her emotional authority. You stop letting moods dictate your movement, and to someone used to being the emotional center of gravity, that feels like abandonment, even if you're still present. A beta provides emotional gravity. He orbits her moods. He adjusts to her fluctuations. He absorbs uncertainty, so she doesn't have to, and while she may complain about him, criticize him, or even disrespect him, she stays, because he makes her inner world easier to manage. The grounded man does the opposite. He introduces structure, and structure forces responsibility. Responsibility is what many women unconsciously avoid, not because they're incapable, but because they've never been required to develop emotional discipline. Modern culture rewards expression, not regulation. It praises feelings, not restraint. So when a man expects mutual respect instead of emotional accommodation, he becomes a threat to a system that told her she never had to adjust. This is why enforcing boundaries often leads to replacement instead of repair. She doesn't try to understand you, she looks for someone else who will resume the old pattern, someone who will listen longer, bend more, explain himself endlessly, and mistake patience for virtue. Not because she hates you, but because she wants relief from self-examination. And here's the truth. Most men never hear. The woman who ignores you for not tolerating disrespect isn't rejecting masculinity, she's rejecting accountability. She's not choosing softness over strength, she's choosing familiarity over growth. Because growth would require admitting that her behavior contributed to the distance, and that admission would shatter the narrative where she's always justified. So when you walk away calmly, without resentment, without drama, without trying to be understood, you aren't losing. You're closing a door that was draining you slowly. And the silence that follows isn't emptiness, it's peace returning. Because the moment you stop tolerating disrespect, you stop negotiating your worth. And any woman who requires you to abandon yourself to stay close was never meant to walk beside you in the first place. There's a quiet moment that happens after a man stops tolerating disrespect, a moment where the noise dies down and clarity begins to creep in. At first it feels like loss, like something slipped through your fingers, but if you sit with it long enough, you realize what actually disappeared wasn't connection, it was tension. The constant low-grade anxiety of monitoring moods, choosing words carefully, bracing for misinterpretation. That weight lifts, and that's when you understand how much of yourself you are carrying just to keep the dynamic alive. A woman who wants to bait her isn't searching for love in the way men understand it. She's searching for emotional containment, someone who will stay steady while she destabilizes, someone who will accept emotional volatility as depth. And when you refuse to play that role, when you insist on mutual respect instead of emotional endurance, you disrupt the entire exchange. You stop being useful to the fantasy she was maintaining. This is why she often doesn't fight to keep you. Fighting would imply investment in balance. It would suggest a willingness to adjust. Instead, she fades. She distracts herself. She rewrites the story internally so she can move on without confronting what was lost. And in her version of events, you didn't leave because of values, you left because you were rigid, insecure, or emotionally unavailable. That narrative protects her from facing the truth. Men often mistake this lack of pursuit as confirmation that they weren't enough, but the opposite is usually true. You were too solid to manipulate, too grounded to sway, too self-directed to orbit her emotional weather. And for a woman accustomed to emotional leverage, that level of independence feels like rejection. Even if you never rejected her, the beta survives in ambiguity. He waits for clarity, he hopes for reassurance. He believes that if he just stays present long enough, the confusion will resolve itself. But confusion isn't a phase, it's a condition. And the man who tolerates disrespect becomes part of that condition, reinforcing it by staying. A grounded man doesn't wait for confusion to clear. He observes patterns. He notices repetition. He understands that behavior is communication. And when the communication signals a lack of respect, he doesn't argue the message. He responds to it by adjusting access. That response isn't punishment, it's alignment. This is where the emotional split becomes unavoidable. One path leads to self-respect and solitude. The other leads to companionship at the cost of dignity. Many men choose the second because loneliness feels heavier than self-betrayal in the short term. But over time, that choice corrodes them from the inside. They lose clarity, they lose direction, they lose themselves slowly enough that they barely notice it happening. The man who chooses the first path pays an upfront cost, but gains something far more valuable: internal peace. His nervous system calms, his mind clears, his decisions stop revolving around someone else's moods, and that calm isn't weakness, it's strength that no longer needs to prove itself. This is why women who want betas often describe strong men as boring or emotionally distant, not because they lack feeling, but because they don't provide emotional turbulence, they don't oscillate, they don't chase highs, they don't collapse during lows, and to someone addicted to emotional intensity, stability feels empty, even though it's exactly what leads to real connection. So when you look back and wonder why she ignored you the moment you stopped tolerating disrespect, remember this: you didn't lose attraction, you removed access to a dynamic that depended on your self-sacrifice, and any woman who only stays when you shrink was never aligned with the man you're becoming. Walking away wasn't abandonment, it was evolution. There's a phase most men pass through after enforcing boundaries where doubt creeps in quietly. Not dramatic doubt, subtle doubt, the kind that whispers at night. Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I could have handled it better. Maybe I expected too much. And that voice doesn't come from weakness, it comes from conditioning. Years of being taught that a man's role is to endure, to adapt, to absorb discomfort for the sake of connection. But endurance without reciprocity isn't strength, it's erosion. The woman who wants to beta relies on that erosion, not consciously, not maliciously, but functionally. She grows comfortable expressing herself without consequence, while the man trims parts of himself to stay close. He becomes quieter, more cautious, less direct, and over time, the relationship survives, not because it's healthy, but because he's shrinking faster than she's destabilizing. When you finally stop shrinking, the contrast is impossible to ignore. Suddenly there's space, silence, a strange calm that feels unfamiliar at first, because chaos had become normal. And in that calm, you begin to hear yourself again. Your instincts return, your judgment sharpens, you realize how often you ignored your gut just to preserve harmony that was never mutual. This is the moment where men either grow or retreat back into old patterns. Growth feels lonely initially because it strips away false closeness, but retreat feels familiar because it promises immediate relief. The beta always chooses relief. The grounded man chooses alignment, even when alignment means standing alone for a while. What women who seek betas fear most isn't strength, it's stillness. A man who doesn't react is harder to influence. A man who doesn't argue is harder to entangle. A man who doesn't chase is harder to confuse. Stillness removes hooks, and without hooks, emotional manipulation has nowhere to land. That's why boundaries don't invite negotiation, they invite replacement. She looks for another dynamic where emotional friction still exists, where reactions are predictable, where silence feels dangerous instead of peaceful. Not because she's incapable of growth, but because growth would require confronting the discomfort she's been outsourcing to others. And here's where most men misunderstand attraction entirely. Attraction isn't just about desire, it's about power dynamics. The beta gives power away slowly, believing that generosity will be rewarded. The grounded man keeps power neutral, believing that balance is the foundation of respect. Women who want the former will always feel uneasy around the latter. The irony is that many women don't consciously want a beta forever, they just don't know how to exist without one. They haven't learned how to regulate emotion internally, so they seek men who will do it for them, but eventually, that man becomes invisible. Because once you rely on someone to carry your instability, you stop seeing them as a partner and start seeing them as infrastructure. A man who doesn't tolerate disrespect refuses to become infrastructure. He refuses to be emotional scaffolding. He offers partnership, not absorption. And that refusal forces a fork in the road. Either mutual respect develops or the connection dissolves. There is no third outcome. So if enforcing your boundaries led to distance, understand the deeper truth. You didn't lose connection, you lost a role. A role that required self-abandonment to maintain proximity. And losing that role isn't failure. It's the clearest signal that you're no longer available for dynamics that drain you quietly while calling it love. Eventually, a man who refuses to tolerate disrespect stops seeing these situations as personal losses and starts seeing them as filters. He understands that every boundary enforced quietly removes someone who is incompatible with the life he's building. And while that realization doesn't erase the loneliness immediately, it reframes it. Solitude becomes temporary, self-betrayal becomes unacceptable. The deeper issue isn't that some women want betas, it's that modern dynamics reward men who abandon themselves slowly and punish men who remain internally consistent. Consistency threatens chaos. And chaos is where emotional leverage thrives. A man who doesn't bend, doesn't chase, doesn't react excessively. He destabilizes that leverage simply by existing. This is why emotionally driven relationships often feel intense at the beginning and exhausting at the end. Intensity masks imbalance. It distracts from the slow transfer of power happening beneath the surface. By the time the man realizes he's been overfunctioning emotionally, the woman has already normalized it. His refusal to continue feels abrupt, only because the erosion happened quietly. A woman who ignores you after you stop tolerating disrespect isn't necessarily cold-hearted, she's disoriented. The dynamic she relied on no longer exists, and she doesn't yet have the internal structure to replace it. Rather than rebuild, she walks away. Not because she doesn't care, but because caring would require reorienting her entire emotional operating system. Men who stay grounded often get mislabeled as detached or emotionally unavailable. But what's really happening is that they're emotionally contained. They don't spill themselves to be understood. They don't collapse to be accepted. They don't offer their nervous system as a negotiation chip. And to someone used to emotional volatility, that containment feels like distance. This is where maturity quietly reveals itself, not in loud declarations of self-worth, but in the ability to remain steady when someone else destabilizes, to not take bait, to not chase validation, to not sacrifice long-term alignment for short-term relief. That kind of maturity doesn't attract everyone, but it attracts the right ones. The beta often believes love is proven by tolerance. He thinks that if he can endure enough, love will eventually arrive as a reward. But love doesn't grow in environments where respect is optional. It grows where two people can exist without managing each other's emotions, and that requires self-regulation on both sides, not endurance from one. A grounded man understands that attraction built on imbalance always decays, so he doesn't cling to it, he lets it pass. He allows distance to do its work, because distance reveals whether connection was based on desire or dependency, and most dynamics that collapse after boundaries were never built on desire to begin with. What remains after repeated cycles of this realization is something rare: emotional independence. Not isolation, but independence. The ability to enjoy connection without needing it to feel whole, to walk away without anger, to be misunderstood without needing correction. That independence is what finally ends the cycle. Not confrontation, not explanation, but clarity. So when women ignore men who do not tolerate disrespect, it's not an indictment of those men, it's confirmation. Confirmation that they no longer belong in dynamics that require self-erasure to function. And the moment a man understands that deeply, he stops asking why she left and starts appreciating why he stayed true to himself. At some point, a man realizes that the real cost of tolerating disrespect was never the arguments or the exhaustion, it was the gradual loss of self-trust. Every time he ignored his instincts, every time he rationalized behavior that didn't sit right, every time he chose peace over truth, he taught himself that his inner compass was negotiable. And once that happens, no relationship can feel safe, because the man himself no longer feels anchored. This is why walking away from disrespect feels disorienting at first. You're not just losing a person, you're shedding an identity. You unconsciously built around being needed, accommodating, and endlessly patient. That identity gave you a sense of purpose, so when it dissolves, there's an emptiness that follows, but that emptiness isn't absence, it's space. Space you haven't occupied in a long time. Women who want betas sense this space immediately. They feel the absence of emotional hooks, the lack of over-explaining, the refusal to chase resolution, and instead of leaning in, they pull away, because that space demands self-regulation. It demands that emotions be processed internally rather than exported, and that demand feels foreign, even threatening to someone used to relational control. A grounded man no longer mistakes being wanted for being respected. He understands that desire can coexist with disregard, and attention can exist without care. What he looks for now is alignment, not perfection, not constant harmony, but a shared capacity to handle discomfort without turning it into chaos. This is where the beta and the grounded man fully diverge. The beta stays to preserve connection, even if it costs him clarity. The grounded man leaves to preserve clarity, even if it costs him connection. One choice leads to prolonged confusion. The other leads to temporary solitude and long-term peace. And here's the part most men never expect. Once you stop tolerating disrespect everywhere, not just romantically, your entire life recalibrates. Friendships shift. Conversations change. You stop explaining your standards. You stop negotiating your time. You stop proving your worth. And that internal alignment radiates outward in ways you don't need to advertise. The women who are drawn to this version of you are different. Not louder, not more dramatic, but calmer, more deliberate, less reactive. They don't test your boundaries because they respect them. They don't mistake stillness for indifference. They recognize it as strength that doesn't need permission. And the women who disappear, they were never meant to stay. They were drawn to the version of you that was still learning, still bending, still unsure. Their absence isn't loss, it's completion. A chapter ending exactly when it was supposed to. This is why men who mature emotionally stop trying to convince women of anything. They don't argue for respect. They don't negotiate attraction. They don't perform masculinity. They live in alignment and let alignment do the filtering. Whoever stays belongs. Whoever leaves was never aligned to begin with. So when a woman ignores a man who does not tolerate disrespect, the final truth is this. She didn't reject him, she released him. Released him from a dynamic that required self-betrayal to survive. And once a man understands that, deeply and permanently, he never chases confusion again. He builds his life quietly, steadily, and lets those who can meet him there arrive on their own. By this stage, a man no longer needs to intellectualize what happened. He doesn't replay conversations. He doesn't analyze tone or timing. He understands that the breakdown wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a mismatch of internal worlds, one built on emotional permission, the other built on personal alignment. And once those worlds diverge, No amount of compromise can bridge them without someone losing themselves in the process. The most profound shift happens when a man stops viewing boundaries as tools for managing others and starts seeing them as expressions of self-respect. He no longer enforces them, hoping for a reaction or a change. He enforces them because that's who he is now. And that internal shift removes desperation from the equation entirely. Women who want betas sense this immediately. There's nothing to push against anymore. No emotional elasticity, no uncertainty to exploit. The man isn't hostile, he's resolved, and resolution offers no friction. Without friction, the dynamic dies quietly, not with drama, but with irrelevance. This is why silence from a grounded man feels so final. It isn't punishment, it isn't avoidance, it's closure that doesn't require permission. He doesn't need her to understand, he doesn't need agreement. His peace doesn't depend on shared narratives anymore. At this point, attraction becomes secondary to integrity. The man no longer evaluates women based on how strongly they feel about him, but on how they behave when challenged, disappointed, or uncomfortable. He watches patterns instead of words, regulation instead of expression, consistency instead of intensity, and what he discovers is simple but sobering. Many connections were never built for longevity, they were built for emotional stimulation. Once stimulation ends, so does interest. But a man rooted in reality doesn't mourn stimulation, he values direction. This is where his life simplifies. Fewer conversations, fewer entanglements, fewer explanations, but more clarity, more energy, more presence. He becomes selective, not because he's guarded, but because he's aligned, and alignment makes chaos unnecessary. The women who can meet him here don't demand tolerance for disrespect. They don't test boundaries out of insecurity. They don't confuse emotional expression with entitlement. They've done their own internal work, or they're actively doing it, and that mutual effort creates something rare, stability without suppression. For everyone else, he remains calm and distant, not out of bitterness, but out of discernment. He no longer participates in dynamics that require him to abandon his center, and that discernment becomes the quiet authority he carries into every interaction. So when women ignore men who do not tolerate disrespect, the final understanding is this: those men were never meant to be absorbed into someone else's emotional system. They were meant to stand in their own. And once a man accepts that fully, he doesn't ask to be chosen. He chooses his path and lets whoever can walk beside him arrive naturally. At the end of all this, a man stops trying to decode women altogether, not because he's confused, but because he's no longer invested in understanding dynamics that require him to contort himself. He realizes that clarity doesn't come from figuring people out. It comes from knowing himself so well that misalignment becomes obvious without analysis. He understands now that attraction built on tolerance of disrespect was never attraction, it was dependence disguised as chemistry. It felt intense because it was unstable. It felt meaningful because it was unresolved. And once he removes himself from that loop, the intensity fades, revealing how hollow the connection actually was. This is the moment a man truly steps out of the beta role, not by declaring dominance, but by refusing emotional labor that isn't reciprocated. He no longer educates, persuades, or negotiates basic decency. He simply lives in a way that makes disrespect incompatible with access to him. Women who wanted compliance interpret this as emotional distance. Women who wanted chaos interpret it as boredom. But women who understand stability recognize it immediately. They don't test it, they don't poke it, they don't try to provoke reactions. They respect it because they know what it took to build it. A man at this stage doesn't feel the need to warn others, prove points, or seek validation for his decisions. His calm speaks for him. His absence answers questions he no longer needs to hear, and the peace he carries becomes non-negotiable. What once felt like rejection now feels like protection. Protection from endless emotional negotiation. Protection from roles that drain without fulfilling. Protection from becoming smaller to keep someone else comfortable. And that protection doesn't harden him, it steadies him. He learns that real connection doesn't require endurance, it requires mutual grounding. Two people standing on their own feet, choosing each other, not leaning, not pulling, not compensating. Anything less isn't partnership, it's imbalance waiting to collapse. So when a woman ignores a man who doesn't tolerate disrespect, the meaning is no longer personal, it's structural. The dynamic needed a version of him that no longer exists, and instead of mourning that, he respects the evolution that made it impossible to continue. This is how a man exits the cycle completely. Not by winning, not by revenge, not by replacement, but by indifference to dynamics that don't honor his values. He stops asking why they choose what they choose and starts building a life where those choices no longer affect him. And in the end, the truth is simple and unshakable. A man who does not tolerate disrespect cannot be used, controlled, or diminished. He may be ignored by those who want betas, but he will always be found by those who want a man rooted in reality. And that is not loneliness, that is freedom.